Welcome to the PHP Essential Training Series, and in this tutorial we're going to talk about the do while loop in PHP. Again, as a reminder, make sure you got your text editor ready and your WAMP or MAMP server is up and running, because we will need those as we work through the exercises in this tutorial. In this tutorial we're going to discuss the do while loop in PHP. The do while construct is very similar to the while loop. The biggest difference is the expression is checked at the end of each iteration instead of in the beginning. This means the first iteration of the do while loop is guaranteed to run, since the truth expression is only checked at the end of the iteration. And if you don't understand what I'm saying right now, don't worry about it. Once I start demonstrating it in the lab, you'll get it right away. But that is the biggest difference in the do while loop. In the do while loop, the code that's inside your curly braces is always going to execute at least one time, because the truth condition isn't checked till the very end of the first iteration. So let's go ahead and go into our development environment and demonstrate what we've talked about. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and drop out of our presentation. Let's drop down into our development environment. I want to confirm that we have our Apache server up and running, which we do. We will be using it for this demonstration. I'm going to go ahead and load up Sublime Text 2, which will be my text editor for the demonstration, and Google Chrome will be the browser that I'll be using. I'm using the same template that we used for the previous exercise in the for loop. And now what I want to do is I'm actually doing a do while loop. So I'm going to go ahead and put some code in. You'll notice we're using that same type of layout that we used before with our template. I'm going to go ahead and save the template as do while underscore one. So I'm going to do a save as do while underscore one .php. And then I'm going to come down into our demo tags. And let me go ahead and put in some code, and I'll explain it as I put it in. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put in a couple of variables. So I'm going to come right inside those PHP tags, and I'm going to paste in two variables. First, I'm creating a variable called numbers, and that's going to be an array. And I'm creating an array size variable, and currently I've got that set to 10. So I'm going to generate a dynamic array, and it's going to be equal to 10 instances or 10 values inside that array itself. So I'm generating an array with random even numbers. You're going to see in a minute where we get the random even numbers from. The first thing I want to do is let's go ahead and put in a for loop. So again, I'm going to go into my text document. Let me go ahead and copy this so you don't have to watch me type it. I'm going to come right down below where I've got those two variables set up, and I'm going to generate a for loop, and I'm going to initiate an I variable that's equal to 0. Then I'm going to ask inside my for loop, is I less than the array size? Let me go ahead and put some space in here so it's a little easier to read. Is I less than the array size? So it's currently I less than 10. If that's the case, I want you to add 1 to the value of I. And then inside the for loop, I'm actually going to put in a do loop. So I know that this is going to generate at least one time. I'm going to say do, and this is where I'm coming up with my random number. So again, I'm going to come right below that opening curly brace, create another variable called random, and it's going to be equal to a random number between 1 and 100. And then I'm going to come down right below it. I'm going to close the curly brace for the do portion of my loop. So I'm going to come right below that, close that do portion, and say while my random number, I'm going to take that number and divide it by 2. And that's called the modulus. When I get to modulus, if I have an equal of 1, in other words, if there's a remainder of 1, I know that's an odd number. I'm going to trash it and generate a new one. And once I get my even number, or once I get an even number, I'm going to put that into my numbers array right here. So I'm going to say numbers array equal the random number. And then I'm going to close out that curly brace, because now I've got my do while loop set up. And I'm going to take my numbers array. Let me come down right below where I've closed out the while loop. And I want to do an ascending sort on the numbers array. And I'm actually going to print it using pre-tags in HTML, because it actually keeps the formatting the way it would be formatted normally. And I'm going to say echo. First thing I'm going to echo is my pre-tag. Then I'm going to do a printr function inside PHP, put the numbers array. Then I'm going to echo the closing pre-tag, and then I will have generated this random number with that while loop, or the do while loop actually. So again, setting up a numbers array, I'm setting the array size to 10. Inside my for loop, I've put a do while loop inside the for loop itself, and I've said for I is equal to 0. If I is less than the array size, increment I, and then run through my do while loop. And the do while loop is setting up a random number between 1 and 100. And it looks at that number, and if the number has a remainder of 1, I know it's not even, so I'll generate a new one because I only want even numbers. And then I push that number into the array, and then I go back and rerun my for loop. Let's go ahead and save the changes, refresh our browser window. Let's actually go in and load up the do while 1. And you'll see now I have generated 10 numbers, and I've got them in ascending order. That's what I did the assort for. They're starting lowest to highest. You'll see I've generated 14, 54, 54, 58, 62, 68. Kind of unusual that in that 10 iterations, I actually generated 2 of the numbers twice. 54 and 98. That's pretty good on 50 numbers. But you can see that the do while loop, it ran this at least one time while it was checking the condition. So it always ran it once while it's checking the condition. And I'll actually do another demonstration to make it a little easier. I do want you to see how we use this inside the for loop. Because when I do use the do while loop, which I don't use it very often, but when I use it, I tend to use it in a for loop for some reason. All right, let me do one more example of the do while loop. Again, it's not one I use very often, but I do want you to understand that it is out there. And it does have a purpose. We do use it occasionally. So again, I'm in that template.php file. Let me do a save as. I'm going to go ahead and save this as do while _2.php. And now let me go to my text file and put some code in here. We go inside my PHP tags. I'm going to set up a variable called I, and I'm going to give it a value of 0. Then I'm going to put an echo command right below that, where I'm actually going to echo. This code will run at least once because I default value is, and then it's going to echo whatever the value of I is. And then I'm actually going to have a do loop, or a do while loop. So I'm going to come right below that echo statement. I'm going to have do. And this actually gives you a much better example of how the do while loop works. Because I'm going to go inside that do loop, or the do while loop, and I'm going to say echo. I value is, and I'm going to echo the value I, so the code block will run. Then I'm going to increment I, so I'm going to add 1 to the value of I, just like we were doing in our for loop earlier. And then I'm going to come down below that and I'm going to put in a while clause for my do while loop. And I'm going to say while I, so in other words the variable I, is less than 10. So while I is less than 10, it's going to go through this do while loop. Let's save this, and it's going to work just as you would expect it. I'm going to go ahead and do a save as, save this into my do while _2. Then I'm going to go in here and I'm going to load the do while _2. And you'll notice you get that block. The code will run at least once because I default value is 0, and then you can see it working its way up to 10. And then when while I is less than 10, it'll execute all that code. As soon as it becomes 10 or more, it stops. But here's the trick with the do while. What if I were to make that variable I and give it a value of 20? In our standard for loop, this code would never execute because I is greater than 10. But in a do while loop, it's always going to execute, this do portion will always execute at least one time. So I'm going to go through here before I increment I and before I even realize that I is greater than 10. Let's save that change, refresh our browser window. And you'll see now the code will run at least once because I, the default value is 20. It picked up that I is 20, but I value is 20, so a code block will run. See, even though I'm running one time, I don't realize till I get to the while portion that I is actually greater than 10, and then it breaks out of that loop. So I'm going to execute the do portion at least one time in a do while loop. That's an important concept of the do while loop, and it's one of the reasons why it's there. If you have to execute your code at least once, a do while loop is the loop to use because the portion inside the do statement of the do while loop will always execute at least one time. So I hope you see how that I use it. I tend to use it in for loops quite a bit, but I wanted you to see how it works, why it's there. And now we'll move on to other aspects of the PHP Essential Training Series. I hope you enjoyed it. See you in the next tutorial.